The blizzard had swallowed everything. Trees bent under the weight of white silence, fences vanished into nothingness, and the sky pressed down like it was trying to crush the earth beneath it. Clara Whitmore had just finished nailing the last shutter when she heard something that made her freeze mid-breath. It wasn't the wind screaming through the cracks in the barn. It wasn't ice breaking loose from the roof. It was a cry, faint and desperate, cutting through the storm like a knife through fabric. A sound so human, so fragile, it didn't belong in that frozen wasteland. She stood there, breath clouding in front of her face, listening. Then she heard it again, closer this time, weaker, like a heartbeat trying to fight through snow and death. Clara didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and pushed through the door into a world that wanted to kill her. The wind clawed at her skin like it had a personal grudge, and the snow came at her sideways, blinding, relentless. She moved by instinct, not sight, her boots crunching over ice and memory. 10 steps past the paddock, she nearly fell. Something was there, half buried in the snow, wrapped in faded red cloth. The bundle moved. It let out another soft, hoarse wail. Clara dropped to her knees, her hands shaking as she pulled back the fabric. It was a baby, barely breathing, skin cold as stone. A shallow cut marked his forehead, frozen blood dried dark against his skin. The fabric wrapped around him bore patterns she recognized immediately. Comanche symbols, handmade, sacred. Her hands moved before her mind could catch up. She lifted the baby, pressed him against her chest, and ran. Clara sat through the night with the baby in her arms, rocking gently by the fire in a chair that had once belonged to her mother. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. Her body moved on pure instinct, the way her hands adjusted the blanket, the way she kept 2 fingers on the child's wrist to monitor his fading pulse. The fever came fast, shimmering on his skin like heat trying to fight through ice. She pressed cool cloths to his tiny forehead, whispered nonsense in a voice she hadn't used in years, words that came from somewhere deep and forgotten. The fire roared, dried her lips, made the walls sweat, but she didn't move. At first light, the child stirred. A weak cry escaped his lips, no stronger than a creak in old wood, but it was something. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. By midday, the snow had softened to a dull, slushy quiet. The world outside looked like it had survived a war. Clara changed the baby's wrapping slowly, carefully, her eyes tracking every bruise, every cut. The child was no more than 8 months old, with a gash on his temple and several small abrasions along his arm. But what made her heart freeze wasn't the wounds. It was the necklace. A small carved bone on a leather cord, symbolic, protective, undeniably Comanche. She had lived near Comanche territories all of her life. Her late husband had traded horses with them before the war turned good intentions into suspicion. She knew the signs, understood the warnings. This child was a chieftain's son, or worse, a warrior's only blood. She bundled him tighter and stared out the window, knowing that no one had seen her bring him in. Yet, that afternoon, she heard the hooves. Just one horse. She moved the baby into the bedroom, tucked him beneath a wool quilt, and pressed a hand over his tiny chest until she felt breath. Then she stepped onto the porch. The rider was Eustace Carter, her nearest neighbor, 50 acres east and 3 drinks into madness on any given day. He stopped short when he saw her, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and something that looked like concern. He asked if she'd seen any strangers, mentioned that a hunting party had gone missing near the ridge. Comanche, he said, like the word itself was dangerous. Clara kept her face still, her voice steady, told him she'd seen nothing but snow. He didn't ride off immediately. He sat there a moment longer, squinting past her toward the cabin windows, searching. She didn't blink, didn't breathe. Finally, he turned his horse and rode back into the white. That night, the baby wouldn't stop crying. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't cold. He was scared. Clara held him close, walking slow circles around the small room, whispering lullabies she hadn't thought of in years. Songs her mother used to hum, songs that once made her own son stop fussing before she caught herself. Before nothing. Before memory tried to dig up the grave she'd spent 5 years covering with silence. The child's fingers curled around her shirt, and she didn't pull away. On the second day, someone else came. Mary Finch, the pastor's wife, tall and nosy, brittle as burnt sugar. She brought bread wrapped in cloth and concern wrapped in curiosity. Clara forced a smile, answered questions with half-truths, and closed the door without another word. Behind her, the baby stirred in the next room. And outside, the sky darkened like it knew what tomorrow would bring. Clara made a decision that night. She couldn't hide the baby forever, not with neighbors sniffing like hounds and snow melting into mud that held tracks longer than memory. But she also couldn't give him up. The child had clung to her finger that evening, his tiny grip stronger than it should have been, his dark eyes following her, as if he already understood something she hadn't said aloud. He was watching. He was learning who she was. And for the first time in 5 years, Clara felt like someone was depending on her again. She stayed up sharpening the kitchen knife, not because she expected violence, but because she knew it would find her if it wanted to. She moved the rifle from the mantel to the table, loaded it, checked it twice. The wind shifted after midnight. The baby slept in a basket lined with wool and faith. Clara sat by the door, hand on the rifle, eyes on the snow, waiting. She must have dozed because she woke with a start to the sound of hoofbeats. 3 riders appeared through the pre-dawn mist like ghosts. Not neighbors. Not white men. They wore buffalo hides and paint across their cheeks. The horses moved like shadows, intentional, focused, silent. Clara didn't move. Didn't reach for the rifle. Didn't even breathe. One of them dismounted, walked slowly toward the chicken coop, knelt, and ran his hand through the snow. He was following something. Clara's heart sank. They know. But then, he did something unexpected. He turned, looked directly at her window, and bowed his head once. Then he mounted again, and the 3 men vanished the way they came, quietly, powerfully, like wind changing direction. She picked up the baby, held him close, and whispered words she wasn't sure were for him or for herself. The 3rd day arrived like judgment. The baby was sleeping peacefully when the sound rolled over the ridge. Distant at first, like thunder, then louder, clearer. Hooves. Hundreds of them. Clara stepped onto the porch and saw a sight no one had witnessed in 2 decades. Comanche warriors, 100 or more, silent, armed, mounted with perfect posture and intent. At their head rode a man draped in a red cloak, long braids hanging past his shoulders, broad-shouldered, a scar tracing his left jaw like lightning. He stopped 50 yards from her house and dismounted alone. He walked the distance in measured steps, dust rising around his boots despite the wet ground. Clara stayed on the porch, the baby stirring in her arms. When the man reached the bottom of the steps, he looked up at her with eyes that held both grief and gratitude. He spoke simply, his voice carrying weight that needed no volume. "You saved my son." Clara nodded once. The man explained that the baby had been left behind during an ambush, that his mother had died, that they thought the child had died too. Clara's voice came out softer than she expected. "I heard him cry." The man's response cut through her. "You heard my blood scream, and you answered." There was silence between them, heavy and sacred. Then he asked the question that changed everything. "Will you give him back to me?" Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked her own question. Will you take him from me if I say no?" The man blinked once, slowly, and said no. Clara looked down at the child in her arms, the boy who had stopped crying when she held him, who had learned her smell, her voice, her heartbeat. She spoke truth she didn't know she was carrying. "I wasn't trying to keep him, but I wasn't ready to lose him either." The man stepped forward, not to take, but to touch the boy's foot gently, reverently. Then he looked up at Clara again and spoke words that would echo through the rest of her life. "You are now part of his story, and blood is never left behind." When the warriors rode away, Clara stood on the porch still holding the baby, knowing he would go with them in the morning, but that for one more night he was hers. And somehow that was enough. She didn't sleep. She tried, but sleep wouldn't come because now that she knew the boy had a name, a father, a place to go, she realized she wasn't ready to let him leave. At dawn, frost crept over the windows like lace spun from ghosts. Clara rose quietly, wrapped the baby in a soft shawl she hadn't worn in years, and carried him to the porch. The land was still. No hooves on the wind, no warriors on the ridge, just silence and the deep, aching weight of goodbye. She rocked him slowly, pressing her lips to the crown of his head, whispering the name she would have given him. Little Hawk. From the treeling came the sound of a single horse. The rider was the woman from the day before. No cloak, no feathers, just a rough wool shawl and quiet eyes like still water. She dismounted without a word and approached. Clara asked about the father. The woman shook her head gently. "He waits. He does not wish to take him from your hands. That is not the way." Clara's arms didn't want to let go. The woman stepped closer, reaching out, but the baby cried softly, a half-waking murmur, as he twisted and buried his face in Clara's collarbone. Both women froze. And then Clara spoke words she didn't plan. "Can I see where he'll go?" They rode together, Clara on her old mule with the baby bundled against her chest, the woman beside her in silence that felt like understanding. They crossed the creek, wound through pines, climbed toward a rise that opened onto a clearing. There, beneath the rise, sat the encampment. Tents made of hide and wood, smoke curling from fire pits, children running barefoot, dogs barking lazily in the sun. A village. A life. A home. The red cloak man rose as they approached, his eyes fixed on the child and something else, a tremble in his throat when the baby looked up at him. Clara dismounted and carried the boy the final steps herself. When she reached the father, she didn't speak. She just looked at him long and steady and whispered words that came from somewhere true. "You waited. I didn't know if you would." He took the child with shaking fingers and nodded. "I wait for what is mine, and I wait for what is sacred." The boy didn't cry. He simply looked up as if recognizing something older than memory. Clara stepped back, but the man stopped her, holding out an object wrapped in cloth. Inside was a carved medallion of bone and turquoise, a pendant worn by clan protectors, a symbol of guardianship. "He will know your name," the man said. The woman behind them stepped forward, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. "In our tongue, we do not call you the white woman who saved him. We call you not Anna, she who walks between worlds." Clara lowered her head. She didn't cry. Not then. But she held the pendant tight in her palm, felt the shape of something she didn't yet understand, and whispered truth that broke and healed her at the same time. "Then tell him I didn't just save his life." She looked up, meeting the father's eyes. "He saved mine." That evening, Clara rode back alone. No baby in her arms, no sound but wind in the trees. But the fire in her house never felt warmer, and the silence never felt less lonely. She placed the pendant above the mantel where sunlight touched it each morning, and every Sunday she baked 2 loaves of sweet cornbread. one for herself, one left on a flat stone by the creek. It always disappeared by morning, and Clara never asked who took it. She just kept baking, kept living, kept remembering that love doesn't end when arms let go. It simply changes shape, becoming something wider, deeper, something that can hold two worlds at once and call them both home.